Welcome to the Field Notes podcast, presented by Seaworthy Functional Medicine. Seaworthy exists to help you overcome your complex health challenges so you can be fully vital. Now, here's your host, Dr. Rob Downey.
What do we need to know about mental health from a functional medicine perspective? Today, we are so fortunate to be joined by Dr. Josh Waddell. Dr. Josh, thanks for your time today.
I'm so glad to be here, Rob. Thanks for having me, and thanks for having a show that really talks about the functional health component, right? I think there's a cool movement in this space, so I'm glad to be here.
It's really a privilege. As I've shared many times, because I'm geographically isolated, I get to be with my tribe when I'm on the podcast, right? So it's super good. I'm one of the
Yeah.
beneficiaries for sure. And just so I don't forget to mention, I realized also right before we jumped on, you were talking about recent changes and increased focus on mental health and functional medicine. The podcast also really keeps me up on a ton that's happening that I had no idea it was going to be so powerful for that reason too. So it's a huge privilege and a total blast.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. I know for me, like I kind of stay a little bit isolated too here in northern Florida. It's really easy to kind of isolate yourself. And so you have these discussions. You're like, oh, that's something that's going on somewhere in the world. That's
Yeah.
cool. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I can imagine in Alaska, that's a whole nother world.
So you're a renaissance person of sorts. You're an integrative psychiatric provider. You're a professor. You have your own podcast, and I was so excited for today as I was looking at what you do because we're going to look at mental health through a different lens of the pillars of health, and I just think it's going to be great and also very specific. So again, thanks.
Yeah. Glad you're here. Yeah. And I'm glad that's helpful for sure.
All right, so let's start with why mental health is so challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when you look at the concept of the mind, right? And like, why does the mind become unwell? It's such an interesting component. And we're not the first group of humans to have this experience, right? Like people have been talking about mind stuff for centuries. It just so happened we're kind of in this place now. We have certain lenses that we look through with it. And so one of the things that we're noticing, especially in the past maybe 20, 30 years, right, is we have this basic understanding, right, of what we know of in the brain. And that understanding has really led us into a lot of different treatment modalities and some of those things. And some of that has been really incredible, right? And some of that has really fallen short. And so now we're at this place post-COVID pandemic, in a world that's more restless than ever before, in a place that, we don't really even have like the brain structures to even live out some of this stuff, right? Because things have just happened so fast. And then the treatments we have aren't where they need to be. And so I think that's kind of where we found ourselves in the world of psychiatry and mental health in general is we have a mass influx of people not feeling well. At the same time, the things that we're bringing to the table to help people sometimes are helpful and sometimes aren't. And I think if we were in other parts of health, that really wouldn't be okay, right? If
Mhm.
people were coming in having heart attacks over and over and over, and we had these issues with our treatments, there'd be a kind of a call to action, right? Like we got to get better at managing cardiovascular accidents. Where
Mhm.
here, not as much. And so I think that's kind of where functional health has opened the door for a lot of that.
Mm. Yeah, I've wondered why we don't, like you say, give it as much attention as we would an epidemic of heart attacks or what have you. And I'm kind of worried all along, A, that it's stigmatized, it's perceived as weak. So our audience, who I thank for joining us, if you have mental health issues or someone you care about does, this is not a character flaw. And then B, I see this in veterans that I take care of. If they've
Mhm.
lost a limb to an IED, then they get a ton of compassion because people can see their suffering. But folks with mental health issues, because it's not overtly visible,
Yeah.
uh, then I think that makes it harder. So, well, let's then. I'm really glad you're addressing this because it's something that's so poignant for me right now. Is just so much unaddressed need. It's just, I just, yeah, it's a really important time to be doing this.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's an interesting place, right? And we'll talk about the pillars. You mentioned that, and just the things that we consume and what we're watching and what we're dealing with and where we live at. And all of those things are really big triggers in that. But I think as you mentioned, the concept of, people who are experiencing mental illness, mental illness doesn't care, right? It doesn't care what you're doing, where you're at, what you're doing, any of those things, if it gears up. But it's also not this thing that just happens out of the middle of nowhere, even though that's kind of something that we've talked about. There's things that are going on biologically that are creating these experiences that you're having. And so if you are struggling with it, there is a way to figure out like what's going on. And if so, there are interventions that exist that are what shouldn't be called like functional health or this health. It's just health. All health can help you feel well. And so we just got to figure out what that is. And I think this call to action, this movement that we're having right now is, can we truly figure out what the heck is going on? Why you all of a sudden started feeling so poorly? And help you restore your wellness.
Excellent. Well, let's go to root causes then. What do people know
So
about?
I think I think something that's always really important is I work out of a phase model, and it's something that I've been teaching a lot about, and this kind of came on. And I think it's important that we kind of reference this because it gives us an understanding of where we're at, right? So mental illness, in my opinion, comes out of a three-phase progression, right? You have some version of a trigger, right? We can kind of talk about that. And that's really where the pillars come in. You have this cellular change, right? Things that happen to your mitochondria, energy production. We're seeing really good research into that. And then that leads into these what I call like symptoms, right? Or neurological changes. And that's where we have issues with serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, all of these other downstream effects. For 50 years now, 60 years in psychiatry, we have solely focused on the phase 3 of that progression. And into Schilderkraut and Alan Koppen and those guys in the 50s and the 60s who came up with these monoamine hypothesis and all these things, they weren't wrong. What they seen had a version of rightness to it, but it still never identified the why. And so when you start looking at root cause illness, the question is not, why is your serotonin and norepinephrine not modulating properly? The question is, how did your mitochondria become so unwell? How did the excitability of your brain change to the point that now you're having these issues? And so when you dive deeper into that, what we see is there's something going on in the pillar system, like you talked about, right? Something happening in your body, your mind, your spirit, or your environment, or maybe all four, that then creates this shift at the cellular level, which then sets off a cascade of things that ultimately then we deem as mental illness. And so I think that's where we're seeing the root causes. Let's move even, phase 2 and the work of Chris Palmer and his team and all these people around the country in the world doing mitochondrial work has been very powerful, right? Because we can see where some of these are happening at the cellular level. And he even says, and I've heard other people say this too, like, but why? Why did the mitochondria become sick? And so I think that's where the pillar system comes in, is that true root cause.
Thank you. I had one of the folks that listens to the podcast the other day, healthcare providers say, yeah, some of the physiology you get into isn't a huge part of my work, but I overall sort of understand the whole person approach. And so I thought I should kind of share again about the mitochondria. It's once you see mitochondrial support work clinically, then it really just clicks. But the part I think that I would characterize as so remarkable, everybody hears that they're the power plants of the cells, but what we don't sort of talk about enough is just that if they're healthy, and they, just can make more energy packets, and then this is where we make hormones. This is where we make all our hormones too. Then every single cell in the body is working better. That's remarkable. And there's a whole bunch of software and hardware protocols that can be run that require a certain amount of juice and bandwidth that needs to come from those mitochondria. So it's almost sort of hard to characterize because it's so fundamental.
Yeah, and I think what makes it even more challenging is they're so vulnerable. When we think of biologically, a question you always have is like, how can something that can contemplate the meaning of life and manage all of the structures and concepts of the body become sick? But when you think about how vulnerable mitochondria are, Absolutely, it makes a lot of
Hmm.
sense, right? There
Hmm.
these energy packed cells are really important, but they can easily be shifted by so many concepts of life. And so I think that that's what makes them so interesting is that you have this energy driver, this powerhouse. It does even more than what we even once thought, right? I remember biology class 20 years ago. We now know way more about mitochondria than we did then. And so I think that's what you're kind of seeing is those drivers and just recognizing that they can be easily impacted.
Mm, yeah. Well, I think the segue that'll help our audience the most is then if I think the pillars are really important. Why don't we set the stage with that, right? Because this is a
Yeah,
big
yeah.
part
So
of
this
that's how you have people map what's going on and what to do about it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, yeah. I think, the whole concept of biopsychosocial, even from like Ingalls' work in the 80s, makes a lot of sense to a lot of people, right? And so it's just trying to figure out what that looks like. And so for me, when I think of these biopsychosocial concepts, if you're in healthcare, you kind of know those statements, but body, mind, spirit, environment, I see those as the drivers of an illness, right? And just how like a table has four legs, and if you go to dinner and one of those legs is off and it keeps shaking, that's the same way of the body or the whole human. And so body considers just your biological symptoms or your systems, right? Everything from your gut health to your nutrition status, vitamins and minerals. What does that look like? You can even begin to incorporate some metabolic stuff in that, hormones, infections. We've seen that post COVID, post other things. See that with young kids who get infections. So these biological things can happen to the body, which then creates the mitochondrial change, which creates the mental health issue. You can see stuff in the mind, right? Which we call like acute stress, trauma, your ACE scores, all of those things that are just these impacts to you mentally that then will change your mitochondria, right? And so some people think of like capital T traumas as the only thing that's there, but any kind of chronic stress, whether you're chronically watching the news and it's overwhelming you, whether you're in a job that you hate and you're just super wore down, whether you're in a marriage that's falling apart, all those like huge stressors change the mind, change the way we think and the way we talk and the way we act, that then create those other changes. From a spiritual perspective, that can be a really loaded and hot topic. But the thing that I always highlight is what is your values and what is your purpose, right? Spirituality, that's kind of where that's driven at, right? Spirit is not faith. Faith is just how you recognize spirit, but spirit in itself is just what is greater than me, right? What do I hold dear? What are the stuff that fires me up? And then what the heck am I doing here, right? Why am I getting out of bed? And so I've worked with people before who they have a spirit problem. And what that would mean is they think they are the greatest thing ever. There is nothing greater than them. And so when you have that viewpoint, bad things happen. Like it's not good. Or maybe your value system gets kind of jacked up, right? Not because maybe all kinds of different things. And so now maybe you're creating a lot of chaos in your life. And then the fourth pillar is environment, right? And so environment we see both from a tribal perspective, right? So who's your inner circle? Who's your tribe? Who the people you're around? I see people who become unwell just because their tribe's not healthy, right? And sometimes it's because those are the people they grew up with and they can't get away from them. Sometimes it's because it's the people they found, whatever. Or it could be the environment they're living in, right? The natural resources. So our air, our water, our sunlight, as you know, in Alaska, right? All of those things can be the trigger to this mental health issue. And so for me, as I try to map this out through a timeline, I'm trying to figure out which one of these pillars are off. And if I can grab a hold of one of those pillars and bring it back down, then I think we can create some stability and restore the wellness. So then these other changes will happen, right? It
Hmm.
doesn't mean that if you do a lot of the mitochondrial protocols, you won't get better. You probably will get a little bit better, but it won't sustain many times because I don't care what you do. If you're in a job you dislike and you feel really stressed, that's there. There's only so much you can do, right? It doesn't matter
Yeah.
what happens.
Yeah. I'm so glad we're getting into this in that I take care of a lot of people and talk to a lot of people who say, I'm doing such and I'm still suffering.
Mm,
And I think the
mm,
pillars explains a lot of that. You provided some of the examples, and I see it too. So, uh, yeah, they're taking their supplements and they're exercising. They're trying to get enough sleep and address it, sleep hygiene. But the relationship sounds so toxic combined with the
mm.
70-hour a week uh, job with a boss, who doesn't respect them, that it's like it feels like they're a very visual person. I feel like I'm talking to somebody standing in a toxic swamp, you
Mm,
know, eating their
mm.
eating their
Yeah.
oatmeal and taking their supplements. And it's sort of like you have to be able to walk out of the toxic swamp. I find it takes a lot of courage. It seems like the identifying characteristic for people who do better is they have a very clear-eyed interest in actually knowing where the fundamental trouble is or where the most important thing to work is, and they're capable of pivoting to that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, it's really great that we live in a world where we can gain so much information. However, there's a zillion detox protocols on TikTok, right? There's all these things out there. And so there's nothing that hurts my heart. I'm sure it's the same for you. Of someone going out and spending their hard-earned cash on a bunch of stuff, and then they come back and they're like, I still feel like crap. It's like, oh man, that hurts my soul. And because it maybe work for one person doesn't mean it's going to work for you. But many times the reason for that is maybe that was their pillar problem, right? How many
Hmm.
people like get better making diet changes because the diet was the problem, right? But then you
Hmm.
see people who their food is on point and they still feel bad. And
Hmm.
so that I think that's where the pillars can help is, well, let's address some of these other places in life. How much sunlight are you getting? What's
Hmm.
stress like? Where are you at biologically? What was childhood like? All
Hmm.
these kind of experiences that we have, and can you begin to track some of these things? And if you can, man, restoration can happen without having to spend a ton of money on, supplements, detoxes, all those things.
Yeah. Yeah. Now more so than in the past, I'm careful to not bury the lead. So, and I try to think through the lens of what our audience is wondering. So, if people are working with you or your team in the process, do they use the pillars to kind of identify themselves through informational resources they get from you, or do they work with you one-on-one to understand there's different ways these
Yeah.
like programs and resources work. I talk more about it now earlier in the show
Mhm.
because I think people are wondering like, oh, is this something I can learn on my own? If I just learn about the pillars, do I figure it out? Or
Yeah.
like functional medicine is very nuanced. A lot of people come in and they've gotten a sequencing issue off, or
Yeah.
they did an unsupported detox or whatever.
Hmm.
So yeah, is this stuff they can figure out for themselves, or do they need somebody who understands the pillars to illuminate what they mean?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. That's something that I've been working through, right? I'm currently writing, I'm trying to write a book right now that can kind of help people just pick it up and see. And I think the pillars for someone just that's experiencing feeling unwell is a great place to look at their life and start trying to come to terms with some of this stuff and figure out where to go. But you are right that there's some of these protocols that exist of if you identify, yes, my problem is biological driven, it's body driven, and it's from when I had an acute bacterial infection as a child. Don't try to do that yourself, right? Like you need to be going to a functional health provider. However, let's say you're like, you know what, I have a lot of the symptoms that align with a lot of gut health issues. You can access a good probiotic. And why not try a good third party tested probiotic before you go down the path of other things? And then if
Hmm.
it doesn't, reach out to those providers. So one of the things that I think for people is as you interact with this information, and if it interests you, just put those four pillars down, write down what's off, what's not off, and just try to piece it together yourself, and see like, could this be it? But just know that there are people out there who will help guide you in that and that have access to way more resources and you can get a hold of, right? Lab testing and all those things are all so incredible in the functional health space, and sure you can get it on your own through certain companies, but just because you have information doesn't mean you have the ability to fix it. And so,
Hmm.
having a good functional health provider can really help you like, oh, here's where it is, right? Because even vitamins and minerals are all playing in this orchestra, if you will, of your body. And so just taking a bunch of B12 may help you, but there's not a guarantee, right? Because if B12 is low, there's probably some other things that are not right too.
Yeah.
Nothing happens in a silo in the body.
Hmm. Hmm. Mm. Well, so what can you share today about things people can do to improve their mental health? Let's say they just, hear the podcast, right? And they think, yeah, I'm suffering, or somebody I care about's really, really suffering. I'm
Yeah,
really
yeah, I
interested
think
in
that's
what
such
this
a
expert has to share.
yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing to do, and I do this with my own life, right? I'm not saying I've got it down by any means, but I look at my four pillars, right? Like what's happening in my body, what's happening in my mind, what's happening in my spirit, what's happening in my environment. And so, are you doing the things that fill up each one of those pillars, right? So, from a body perspective, just assessing the food you're eating, right? We know that food quality and food quantity are a big challenge in our country as well as other countries, right? People have heard me say this before, health, unfortunately, especially in America, health's not a right. And so, being able to access good food isn't always attainable. However, are you accessing good food? Can you access good food? If you can't, what kind of resources can you find to help yourself do that? You can easily get some fruit in an area or get some meat in an area or whatever you choose to eat if you find those ways to kind of navigate those spaces, right? So focusing on your body and then looking at it from a mind perspective, man, how are you spending your time? Like, what are you consuming into your mind? The amount of people that I see who find themselves feeling really unwell solely because of what they're consuming every day, right? We think like, oh, well, I'm just not going to watch the news. That's great, but that social media algorithm knows what you're doing. And it really takes that on. And the amount of people I work with who find themselves being perpetually anxious or overwhelmed because they're just chronically watching these things. So, how am I spending my time? What am I consuming? What is the people around me like in my environment? Those kind of things are kind of stress related. And then, when you look at it a spiritual perspective, what do you value? What do you hold dear? What gets you fired up in the day? And if you wake up and you're like, nothing fires you up, that's probably not a good thing, right? And it doesn't mean that we've got to go out and, tear it down, right? I love this statement. I say it a lot. We live in a world where we know much more than we probably do need to know, right? We don't, we weren't meant to know about all the bad things that are happening in the world. That just wasn't something that is, like if I was, 200 years ago, if we were living, out on the plains and Bob's barn burns down, I wouldn't get on social media and be like, no more barn burns. Like I would walk down to Bob's house and help him rebuild his barn because he was part of my tribe. So we got to decide how much of it we want to consume and can we actually control a lot of the stress that we are consuming. And if we can, do something about it. But if you can't, being able to relinquish some of that and kind of move on. I know that's easy to say, but I think that's a really important part from the spiritual component of there are things that fire you up. If you don't have those, that's a problem. But then if too many things are firing you up, that's probably a problem too, right? And then from an environment perspective, it's being able to look at who is around you and what kind of world you're living in. And we see people, I mean, I live in a really beautiful place. I know you're in a beautiful place right now as well, even though it's really cold. But even in these places, mental health issues happen, and there's a gamut of reasons why. But, just because you're at the top of a mountain doesn't mean you're still getting good air. Just because you're right by the sea doesn't mean you're getting good water. And so being able to prioritize those resources, I think, are really, really important. And I know as I'm saying all four of these, it can be like, oh my gosh, there's so much I need to do. What is it? The old things of like, I love Andrew Huberman and the work that he does. But if you were to do all the protocols he sets out, like your day would start at like what is it, like 5 a.m. and you would go to work at like 10 a.m. or something. Like it just takes like that long. So there's only so much you can do. And I think that's where, you put all four of those categories down. What are you doing in each one of them and what seems to be an issue? And you're going to see it. It's pretty glaring, but there are some hidden stuff. I think the work that's being done in Colorado right now in Utah, where you're seeing a connection between mental health issues and altitude, right? And that alone being a driver and just addressing the altitude is a game changer for people, right? So knowing your area, knowing what's around you, knowing the world you're in, I think is really important from an environment perspective. So that would be the first place to start. 4 pillars, what's off in these 4 pillars, and how can I go in and intervene in those? I would preface that and say though, that's easy to say if you're not depressed,
Yeah.
and so if you find yourself very depressed and very anxious, that's where you may need to try those other things, right? Whether that comes from a pharmaceutical down in the phase 3 world, or it comes from some oxidative stress and some of those things and working with that kind of provider, that's why those things exist, in my opinion, right? I like to say all the time, I love functional health. I do functional health. But if you're running around believing you're God, butt naked outside, changing your diet isn't going to fix that, right? Only a
Hmm.
high dose of a
Hmm.
dopamine antagonist is going to calm you
Hmm.
down to where we can do that work. And
Yeah.
so we have to be able to do that work
Yeah.
to do that. So just recognizing that if you're not getting the success you're looking for, or you just can't get it going, seek out these providers. Just because you start taking a medicine, this is a hot topic, doesn't mean you have to take that medicine forever. But
Hmm.
if that is what gets you up and gets you going, man, do it and then move to these other things.
Hmm. Very good. So helpful. And I see people think they have to do it all to get well. And I always remind them what's great about these ways of thinking, just the power of illuminating where to look when you go sort of listen to your body intelligence, listen to your intuition, even just simply what kind of strikes you as the area. Oh, yeah, I've thought that might matter to me, but
Mhm.
nobody's endorsed it. So I never took the time to try cleaning up the relationships or the environment or improve the food, reasonably something. And then there's a positive shift. And the difference is, this is why I'm continuously frustrated with conventional medicine because it's so mechanistic.
Mhm.
If we truly were machines, if the brain was a computer, the nerves were wires, the guts were plumbing, you wouldn't get that much payoff, from
Yep.
upgrading your operating system. But because we're more like ecosystems in nature, when you
Mhm.
clean up your mental health and quit flooding the zone with distressing stuff, uh, then then other things get better. All the different parts of the ecosystem are in communication with and supporting one another, and then it's easier to identify the next one, and then there's even more clarity for the next one. And so even the path of progress isn't sort of mechanistic. It's more sort of I use the word fractal, but my friend Keisha Ewer says like people don't resonate with that, but like things look the same at multiple levels, microscopically, macroscopically, these sort of Paisley mathematic patterns. We do change fractally over time. There's a blossoming. And so if people just
Mhm.
make a play, a good thing happens. Make a play, a good thing happens. By the time they're deciding on the fourth pillar, the other three have shifted and the fourth pillar looks different. That's my
Absolutely.
experience.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right on. And I think, and that's what I think is so beautiful. I teach my students a lot about using a timeline, because if you work that timeline back, you will see what was the first catalyst. And that's the first thing to get on, because many times, and I know you see this too, and many providers who are out there working see this, all four pillars for some people are messed up, right? Like body wise, their diet's poor, they're not getting good nutrition. Mentally, they've experienced so much chaos, right? And they're just stressed out of their mind and their financial issues and all these things. And spiritually, they don't even know what they're doing, where their purpose is at. And environmentally, they've got all these problems. And so it's like, where do you start? If you use that timeline, illness doesn't, and it's a hot topic, but illness doesn't just come out of the middle of nowhere, right? This has occurred over time. And so if we
Mhm.
can work backwards and see, okay, what was going on, then you start working that stuff out. And you will see some people who, if they're working through the pillars and they're doing something for a little bit, and maybe they get a little bit of improvement there, but not there, that's probably because they're in the wrong pillar.
Mhm.
Right. Like if I'm working on my gut health and I'm just wearing it out, right? I got good probiotics on board. Everything's getting better. And my gut gets better, but my brain don't. My gut problem probably wasn't the cause of my brain problem. My brain problem
Mhm.
was causing my gut problem. And so I got to
Mhm.
keep searching and looking. And so you
Yeah.
are right. There's such a progress to illness and a progress to healing. And I think
Mhm.
that's probably one of the biggest challenges in conventional medicine is many times we will relinquish that, oh, there's a progress to it. We're just like, take this medicine and you're better. And that's not how it worked,
Yeah.
like even for people who are in like severe, what we call like excitable frenzies, right? Like that we would identify in schizophrenia and bipolar mania, that didn't happen overnight, right? There
Mhm.
were things going on, things that we don't
Mhm.
see, but things
Mhm.
going on to kind of create that.
I want to encourage people to do what Dr. Josh is talking about and look at the timeline, lay out what happened, what was the impact from birth, pre-birth, what was the health of your mom, all the way up till now. Just map out everything that happened, all the events, the personal events, the medical events, the joys, the transformations. Just map it out on a sheet of paper and then go look at those points. And if the events, the diagnoses, the signs or symptoms are all kind of mapped out there, it's mind-blowingly helpful. And
Oh, absolutely.
just
Yeah.
that one exercise alone is a really useful tool.
Yeah, and I think it's powerful too to see the things that begin to decline, right? Like, and there's a lot of discussion on this from at the sociological level, right? Of just as you develop and we get ingrained in certain societies, we start to lose certain things, right? And it's wild as you begin to look at what was really exciting to you as a kid, and what's
Mhm.
exciting to you now. Why
Mhm.
is that not exciting to you anymore? Like
Mhm.
all of these things that kind of do that. And if you can figure those things out, I do believe a wholeness can occur.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think if you start with anything, start with that.
Mm. Well, for folks that do benefit from supplements, what do folks need to know there?
Oh, I think it's a great point, right? I think the supplement world is so cool because there's not a lot of regulation, so good stuff can get to consumers faster. However, there's not a lot of regulation, and so all kinds of stuff can get to consumers faster. And so because of that, we really struggle, I think, in the supplement world and the herbal world, the adaptogen, the neurotropic world of ensuring that there's really good qualities out there, right? So I think the first and foremost thing to remember about supplements is it's called a supplement for a reason. It's supplemental, right? So if I'm taking
Mhm.
vitamins, if I'm taking minerals, I'm supplementing what I should be getting from my food. And so whether
Mhm.
that's due to access, whether that's due to just your rhythm, whatever, if you can prioritize food, prioritize it, right? Know what that
Mhm.
is. We know what foods are higher and what foods are not. We know that all these vitamins and minerals work together. Do that. However, if you are going to use a micronutrient or a broad spectrum micronutrient in any way, just make sure it's third party tested. I think that's the biggest thing. You can get online, you can go to any company that's out there, hit the about me, go down to the bottom, check it out, and see if they're third party tested. If they're not, you need to stay away from it. Doesn't mean they're
Mhm.
bad, but it just means
Mhm.
that there's no oversight in that, right?
Mhm.
I think that the second thing is that just because it says that it's in there doesn't mean it's a guarantee that there's certain things in there. So I've heard Sean Wells, he was on my podcast a couple of years ago, talk about try your best to stay away from proprietary blends. So if you look on the
Mhm.
back of ingredients of those like proprietary blend or like alpha male blend or whatever, right? And
Mhm.
in that, they'll have numerous things listed and it'll say like 1,000 milligrams to the side. The thing that's listed first is the most abundant. The things that listed last is the least abundant. But there's no guarantee, right? So just
Mhm.
because it says ashwagandha in there at the end of it, that doesn't mean 200 milligrams of that 1,000 milligrams is ashwagandha. We don't know. So
Mhm.
really try to stay away from those blends and kind of know what you're getting, how much you're getting, what that looks like, and be third party tested in that way. From an herb perspective, I think the biggest thing is know what that herb is supposed to do. Right?
Mhm.
I think one of the downfalls we're seeing, especially in some of the adaptogens, is that everybody thinks that they need ashwagandha or everybody thinks they need rhodiola. And that's not
Mhm.
true. And so I think two things are happening. One, people are spending their hard-earned money and they're not getting a benefit. And then two, that herb gets a bad rep because it's like, it didn't help me. Well, the reason it didn't help
Mhm.
you because that's not what your issues are. And so one of the things that I treat out of is like a concept of excitability, not only from a mitochondria level, but a symptom level. And so we call them hyperexcitable or hypoexcitable. So do you have hyperexcitable depression or hypoexcitable depression? Do you have hyperexcitable anxiety or hypoexcitable anxiety? And when you see it as that, some of these herbs work really well for hyperexcitable stuff. So if I find myself having hysterical crying spells, thinking about hurting myself, can't sleep, overeating, those symptoms get you the diagnosis of depression. I don't need something to lift me up. I'm already
Mhm.
too up. I need something
Mhm.
that's going to calm things down, something
Mhm.
like an ashwagandha root. Whereas if I'm waking up, I can't get up, I don't want to do anything, I have no energy, have no motivation, I do need to be lifted up, right? Ashwagandha root is probably not going to be super helpful for that. But things like rhodiola rosea can be very helpful, or Panax ginseng can be very
Mhm.
helpful for that. So just try to know, if you're starting to, look at that as someone who's thinking about taking them, what symptoms are I'm trying to treat? And is this actually going to help that symptom?
Mhm.
And I think that those are two ways to kind of navigate that. Once again, with those two, make sure they're third party tested. I mean, there's a lot that's out there. I've heard Sean talk about too, like if you're buying from like, Amazon is a big one that a lot of people buy stuff from. When you're buying on Amazon, you'll see like manufacturer and then seller. make sure you know where that's coming from. There are some bad characters out there who will get a hold of a pure encapsulation bottle, which is a really reputable company, and put their stuff in it, right? So just know like this is actually coming from Thorn or Pure Encapsulation or Now or Garden of Life, whoever you're using. Those would be my recommendations for sure.
Hey, I wanted to ask you, where does the name Aruka come from?
Aruka is a cool. When I got into this world, I wanted to kind of look at like holistic healing and all the things. And Aruka is actually a Hebrew term that means restoring wellness or restoring wholeness. And so I just thought that was a good way to kind of do that, right? Is that we're just restoring wholeness through these four pillars. And so that's where Aruka came from. So that's
Nice.
kind of how I got into that.
Nice. Are there things you wanted to share we didn't get to?
I think that the biggest thing is that if you're wanting to learn more on the mental health space, there's so many good people out there, not just myself. I mean, there's a lot of people out there, beating these drums. And so, just get out there, try to figure out what you want to listen to, what you want to learn about. If this is something that's in kind of your wheelhouse of learning, I have a podcast called Mental Maps, and we've had the really cool opportunity just to set with a lot of people, right? And by setting with people, I get to learn a lot, and then I do teachings on there as well about what type of magnesium do you need for your brain, and what type of zinc do you need for your brain, and how do you dose it? What does it look like? So if you want to check that out, definitely check out the podcast. You can follow us on Aruka Well Life. That's on Instagram. And man, we do some pretty cool things. I don't do that. I'm by far not a specialist in social media. I have a person that helps me, and she is incredible. And so we have some cool things that are out there of different resources and ways to go about that. If you're a provider, we offer a consulting component to Aruka where we help you get to this place, right? Not only from a psychopharm perspective, but also an herbal perspective, a diagnosis perspective, those kind of things. So definitely reach out to us. It doesn't matter what state you're in. We can do that. If you're in the state of Florida right now, we have the access to help you as a client. So that's arukawell.co. Somebody took my M. So thanks a lot, whoever owns my M. So I had to do .co instead of .com, which is really funny in the world. But I thought that was like cool. It's like down with the man, whatever. So arukawell.co is my company, and so you can check that out. But I think those are ways you can connect with us. If there's things you want to know about, things you're interested in, reach out to us. There's many shows that we do solely because somebody reaches out. It's like, hey, this would be interesting, or hey, I'd like to learn more about that. And we've got to learn a lot from psychedelic stuff to nutrition stuff to health stuff to social stuff. Really, the whole concept is just looking at something in one of those four pillars.
Very cool. What a great conversation today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I think it's really cool that there's this space talking, and I hope that the more people that continue to have these conversations, as I said earlier, we can remove the concept of ancient healing and Western healing and functional healing, and it's all just healing. It's all just health. And so if we can do that, I think we're going to fight some of the terrible things that we see in our world today. And then, as you said, man, if you're out there and you're struggling, just know it's fixable. And I know it's easy for me to say because I'm not in your brain. I tell my patients that all the time, but it's fixable. You just got to get in there and start doing that work. Maybe you do need to engage with that phase 3 through medicine or something like that to get things going. Maybe you don't. Maybe you just jump in the mitochondrial world and get on that. Or maybe you just sit at home and start trying to figure out this pillar concept. Either way, if you're not feeling well, there's more than just taking this medicine for the rest of your life and living that way. And there's case studies across the country to prove it. So seek out that help.
I think that's a really beautiful cap to the conversation. So thank you again.
Thank you, Rob. I'm glad to be here, man.
Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks for joining us for the Seaworthy podcast. Seaworthy exists to help people overcome their health challenges and be fully vital. If you think we've earned it, please consider giving this podcast a like, subscribing, and giving us a 5-star rating on the platform of your choice. Thanks.